Hey guys, Tony Rowe here, doing a review of my first round Lichess 45+45 league game. But first, apologies for the long lapse in videos. I got sick and with some kind of like local flu bug that everyone was getting, and my doctor warned me that I might get some kind of secondary infection. And sure enough, a week later, I got bronchitis, and I've been fighting that off for 2 weeks now or so, and I feel pretty good. I'm still coughing a little bit, and my nose is still a little bit stuffed up, and it's hard for me to talk sometimes, so I haven't been recording that much. But I'm back, so I do apologize for that. Second thing, before I move on, just administrative details. The winners for my books have been contacted. I picked 2 winners instead of 1, and those books are getting sent out very shortly. So if you were wondering about that, Laken Wecker and Colin Vandermeer were the winners. So shout out to them, and thanks for all the support on your channels. I've been reading through all of the ideas that you guys posted, and I have at least one video scheduled for release that was suggested there. So I'm taking those suggestions into account, and hopefully you guys enjoy the content. Okay, so let's get to the game. Actually, this game was interesting sort of in the preparation phase too. So looking at my opponent's games, I'm white, of course, and I know who I'm playing, so I know my color and who I'm playing. It's really easy to sort of look at their games and see what they play against what I play and make sort of an executive decision from there. So one thing I noticed right away during my preparation was that after knight f3, my opponent had moved around a lot and played a lot of different things. He had played a lot of reverse Grunfelds, either straight through this move order or with knight f6, castles, knight c6, d4 first. And he had also played something like, let's say, d5 and then knight f6 and gone into Anglo-Slav, something like this. And he had also played one knight f6, and after g3, like I always play, he had gone into a lot of reversed Grunfelds. So from a preparation perspective, it was starting to look a little bit difficult to do anything serious because he had played a lot of different disparate systems. And in addition, he had a bunch of random games in other systems that weren't featured heavily, but he had tried before. So he had a lot of stuff. But one thing I did notice is that after 1c4, he almost always played the same line. So after 2g3, which is what I normally played, he usually went into the 3 knights and played 4 bishop c5. And this is a line that I think is pleasant for white, and it's a line that I really enjoy playing just stylistically. For whatever reason, I score well from these positions, and I like to play them. And I usually play 5e3 here, which is not the most popular move. The idea being to go put the knight on e2 and blunt this bishop, and at some point go d4 in the future, or f4 possibly. And I noticed that he usually was heading down here and then either playing bishop f5 or h6. And again, I think this line, I was very happy to play this line, and I think even practically speaking, black maybe is just slightly worse here, but tends to score really bad because his position is a little bit tenuous. White's pieces are on the right side of his pawn, sort of. It's easy for white to expand on the queen side with a3, b4, d4, and blunt this bishop maybe by c5 at some point. Or against a bishop that, let's say, goes to f5 after something like d4, bishop b6, h3. It's really easy for white to go h3, g4, and on bishop g6, go f4. Let's say something like, I don't know, like this. It's really easy for white to go g4, bishop h7, f4, and then f5 later, blunts this bishop. And so you can see white is it's easy to expand, and it's much easier to play white. So I was pretty happy to play these positions. But my opponent surprised me as well, And in this specific position, he went d5, entering into the reverse dragon, which I wasn't unhappy about. I have a lot of experience here. Before I started my channel, so most of you guys are probably familiar with just me playing knight f3 on move 1 all the time. But before I started my channel, for many, many years, I played the English exclusively. My copy of the dynamic English is like in tatters. Oh, actually, my first copy is in tatters. I gave that away. I bought a second copy, and that copy is also pretty busted up from extensive study. So it got to the point where I knew like what the page numbers were for certain lines in that book. So I was not unhappy to play 1c4, and I was not unhappy to see the reverse dragon. So after c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight c3, my opponent went knight b6, and this is the best move for sure. And let me annotate that. This game will be in a study, by the way. I'll link to it. My opponent goes knight b6, and it might seem a little bit counterintuitive to some people who don't know the theory of the reverse dragon, because in the normal dragon, it would be very thematic for white to protect the knight by moving out this bishop to this square. And this is sort of analogous to, let's go back, 1 e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6. This is sort of analogous to the reverse dragon line, or the normal accelerated dragon line, where white goes bishop e3, which is a totally normal move. Or like the usual dragon Yugoslav attack with something like bishop e3. This is a very normal move. However, it's a little bit less effective to do this sort of thing in the accelerated move orders, these Yugoslav attacks, because when black does not play d6 early, he's free to go d5 in one move. And if you've watched my Reddit opening of the week Sicilian videos, you know that in the Sicilian, usually if black gets in d5 successfully, he's equal or better, because black has a little bit less space, and he's happy to sort of bust open the center and trade off this e4 pawn, which constricts his play a little bit, and leaves black with the only center pawn, an e pawn versus no center pawns. So in these accelerated move orders, like if white goes for the Yugoslav attack, for instance, with something like, or just plays like a very classical setup, castles, if white does nothing about d5, black would just play d5, and he's up a tempo compared to the normal dragon because he's not played d6 and d5. And so a lot of times you'll see in let's say like the classical dragon something like this: castles, bishop e3, knight c6. White will go knight b3 and put another attacker on d5 by exposing the queen to the d5 square. And it's similar in this case. So black adds the queen to the d4 square. Something like bishop e6, knight f3, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, which would be sort of analogous to our classical dragon line that I just showed you, would be met by d4 immediately. And not only has white saved a tempo by not having to go d3, d4, but white is also up a tempo in general because the position is reversed. Let me turn off the engine arrows here. That could be kind of annoying. Okay. So black goes knight b6. And the usual accelerated or reverse dragon line would just be something like knight f3, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, and then white has a ton of moves. White can go d3, white can go a3, there's rook b1, I think is recommended by Krzysztof Sielecki in his new Chess 24 series. White can even go b3, I'm not sure how great that move is, but all these moves are possible. But I play a slightly rare line that's becoming really popular nowadays, which is e3. And the idea, of course, is to go knight e2, and then white can usually have his choice between d4 and or f4. Not a particularly common scheme of development, especially when you consider how weak the d3 square is. But yeah, it just happens to work out here, I think, because white's up a move. So my opponent plays the most popular and natural line, which is just classical development, castling, and white goes f4 here. And my opponent played a very natural move. I think it's probably second best. So my opponent plays e takes f4 here. I don't know if he was still in his preparation. My opponent played, in general, the whole game pretty quickly. So it's not clear when he left his preparation. But he played quickly here, and e takes f4 I don't think is a blunder or anything, but I think it's slightly dubious compared to just bolstering the center after f4 with f6. And this has been played in a couple games, Romain Edouard versus Etienne Becreau in 2012. And then in 2014, Gowan Jones actually had this position as white against Romain Edouard and won. There have been a couple other high sort of grandmaster-ish 2600-2700 games. And white normally goes f5, bishop d7, and then d4. And the position obviously is kind of a mess. This is one either upside or downside to playing this 6e3 line, is that a lot of positions after this 6e3 move end up being completely bizarre compared to, just normal classical chess positions. And even Englishes. It certainly doesn't look like the usual sort of reverse dragon style positions that you'd get after knight f3, so it's kind of a mess. But if you're prepared, I think that helps you bringing your opponent into these sort of irrational, unfamiliar waters. So after e takes f4, knight takes f4, my opponent went knight e5, which is by far the most popular move in this position. Of course, threatening to go knight d3 perhaps and hop into the very weakened d3 square, which is a function of me playing e3 in the first place, or just going knight g6 and trying to trade off this good knight on f4. And so really white, because of the threat of knight d3, has no choice but to play d4 and knight g6. So this is sort of standard play after e takes f4, and actually my opponent got a little unlucky here because I didn't prepare ahead of the game for this specific line, but I've studied this line in general and had probably 3 or 4 games, I would guess, reach similar positions in Lichess Blitz games, and I have had this exact position before. If you look in the Lichess database, I've had this position 2 or 3 times. You can check it out. And in the first game that I played on Lichess from this position, I played just very natural e4, with the idea being that knight takes f4, bishop takes f4 must be at least slightly better for white. Big center, slight lead in development, active bishops. But one thing about this position that I think is really important, and it's just an important concept to understand in chess, is the concept of understanding when it's right to trade like a set of minor pieces or keep minor pieces on the board. And in this case, I think a lot of factors point to me not wanting to trade this thing for this thing. The first one is that I have more center space, and I will have even more center space after a later e4. And if you have more space in the center, or more space in general, it helps you to not trade pieces. The reason being is that it's hard for your opponent who has a space disadvantage to comfortably develop his pieces on harmonious and natural squares when he's confined on space. And so if you leave him with more minor pieces, it's harder for him to arrange his pieces. A space advantage ceases to really be an advantage if you start trading off a bunch of minor pieces. It's easy for your opponent to find squares for his pieces, etc. The second thing is if you just imagine that I don't trade pieces, let's say, in the game I played knight d3. I think this is by far the strongest move. If you take a look at this knight on g6, it actually doesn't have any good squares. e7 is occupied, and all of these squares, e5, f4, h4, are blocked off by my pawns. And so, and in addition, my knight on d3 is relatively well placed. It's just a well centralized knight. And so the quality of the minor pieces after the refused trade is quite a bit in my favor. The g6 knight is bad. The d3 knight is fine. So actually, Stockfish showed me this move a long time ago in this position, and I just happened to remember it. So up through now, I didn't think much at all about any of this, and I was sort of just within my opening knowledge. And I assumed that after knight d3, my opponent would play c6, which he did. And now I sort of have to figure out how to finish my development. And e4 and bishop e3 would be great. That would be perhaps the most optimal placement of my pieces. But of course, one downside to this knight on d3 is that... whoops, I hit show threat by accident. By the way, if now when you're analyzing with Stockfish on Lichess, if you press X, it will show you the threat. Basically, it switches the color of who's to move. But now with this knight on d3, I can't go e4 because queen takes d4, hangs the pawn. So, and bishop d2 is just kind of lame. So I decided to just go b3, and after my opponent's very natural bishop e6, bishop b2, my opponent went queen c8. And I think this move probably turns out to be a little bit dubious. Actually, this position has been reached in one game now that I see in 2012 by Victoria Schmelita versus Alexandra Kosteniuk, so a pretty high-level women's game. And black won, but it was actually white to move in that game, and white played knight f4. So I have a tempo-down version of no, I just have a normal version of this game. But queen c8, I think, turns out to be a little bit dubious because the idea of bishop h3 doesn't actually work out for black. This is a very natural move. Black just wants to go rook d8 and bishop f3. Let me make those a different color. This diagram is getting to be a huge mess. Black just wants to go rook d8 and bishop h3, which is fine. It's a natural idea, but tactically it turns out that bishop h3 is not very good. But this was the first move where I had a really long think, because white, as you can see, I sort of labeled a lot of candidate moves. I'll take those away for a second. The first one, now that the queen is on c8, white can just expand in the center with e4. If he doesn't want to do that, some development of the queen is fairly natural, like let's say queen c2, queen e2. It's also pretty logical to just go rook c1 and place your rook opposite of the opponent's queen. I even thought about a move like rook f2. The idea being that the rook in general is pretty good on f2. It can switch over to squares like c2, d2, e2, but also on bishop h3, I can move my bishop now that it's unpinned. So that's an option. It's even worth considering something like a4, a5, a6, etc., trying to break up black's queen side and kick this knight out. Excuse me. Still a little sick, like I said. But I thought about this for a while, and I sort of decided that perhaps queen e2 was the best move here. After the game, I decided that queen e2 was the best move. I played e4, and I think maybe this is just about as good as queen e2. It's hard for me to say. I actually played e4 with a slightly incorrect idea. So my thought in playing e4 was that I know I'm always going to want to play e4 and expand in the center, but I'm not really sure where my queen should go or where my rook on a1 should go, etc. And a move like a4, rook c1 just seems slightly less precise to me. Like, I'm not sure if I want to go queen e2, rook a to d1, or queen c2, rook a to d1, rook a to e1. Just wasn't sure. And a4 just didn't seem as purposeful as other moves. Same with rook f2. So it really came down to something like queen c2, queen e2, or e4. And I just decided to go e4 because I thought it was the most flexible. And my idea when I was calculating in this position was to meet black's very likely rook d8 with this sort of humorous queen e2. And as you can see, the idea was that I really thought that the e3 square was the best square for my knight. And so I'm clearing out the d1 square to go knight d1 to e3 and protect my d4 pawn with the bishop on b2. So I thought that this ultra-symmetrical knight on e3, knight on d3, bishop b2, bishop on g2, and pawns on e4, d4 was perhaps the most harmonious setup I could ask for. And so I wanted to meet rook d8 with queen e2. My point being that rook takes d4 could be met by something like knight d5 with a discovered attack on this rook on d4, and it's now trapped. And I looked at all kinds of captures here, and only after probably about 5 or 10 minutes, I would guess, did I realize that, like I looked at knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d5, all of them, rook takes e4, all these moves, bishop g4, etc. Only later did I realize that rook takes d5 is a pretty clean equalizer for black. He is down in exchange, but black has bagged both of my center pawns for it and has an extremely solid and compact structure, which makes my rooks relatively ineffective in this position. And I think I would almost prefer black, but it's probably around equal in this position. 2 pawns for the exchange and a very solid position seems totally fine for black. So I played e4, and after rook d8, I just sort of double-checked queen e2 and decided that based on this rook takes d5 that I didn't like it. And so after rook d8, I had to acquiesce to knight e2, just protecting the pawn on d4 like so. And that's why I think probably after the position after queen c8, I should probably just go queen e2 and hold back on e4. The point being is that something like rook d8, maybe now I can go knight d1, and then e4, and then knight e3, and just sort of switch up the moves to get the position that I wanted. So just an interesting finesse, and I thought it was probably almost the longest think of my game because the opponent just sort of got unlucky here. So this was like sort of the first move outside of just my normal opening knowledge and then natural development with b3, bishop b2, which I didn't think about that much. So after rook d8, knight e2, my opponent went bishop h3. And if you want, take a second here and think about how you might react to bishop h3. Okay, so bishop h3 turns out to be a kind of a catastrophic blunder here. And it might not be obvious at first, but it fails to bishop h3, queen takes h3, and then rook f5. And the point being is that, I made this analysis in ChessBase and kept all the arrows, and when I imported it, they all showed up. So it's kind of a little bit of spoilers. I won't do that again. It's kind of annoying. But the point is that after rook f5, the queen can no longer bounce back to, how do I make red? There we go. The queen can no longer bounce back. This rook is in the way. And something like knight f2, queen h6, bishop c1 would win material or trap the queen, etc. And so it's actually pretty hard here for black to find a move to save himself. And take a second and think about what you would play here as black if you want. It's quite difficult. My opponent found a relatively clever idea here, one that I did not see at all when I played rook f5. So I'm really lucky that it didn't end up working out. But he played knight d5. The point, of course, is that e takes d5 is met by queen f5, and I'm losing. And he's also just threatening, very simply, knight e3, forking the queen and the rook, and threatening mate, by the way. So something of a problem here, and actually I almost blundered, or I'd call it a blunder. So I looked for a very long time at the most natural knight to f2, and I thought that the best that I had was queen h6, bishop c1, knight e3, basically only move blocking this, and then queen d3. And I thought that black was now faced with the threat of just bishop takes e3 winning a piece. I thought that black basically had to go into this position where white has a queen for rook and bishop and a big center, and probably I'm winning after something like h3 or king g2 or rook f1 or whatever. A lot of moves, but it didn't seem to me to be like super easy just because black is pretty solid, and he has basically enough material for the queen. So I wasn't super certain about this, nor did I see anything after this move to make me think that going into this position was all that great. So black would have a rook for 2 knights here, a rook and a pawn for 2 knights, and I have this isolated d pawn, and my king is a little bit fishy. I think black is totally fine here. So, but the funny thing is, one thing I didn't notice is that after knight d5, knight f2, queen h6, that my rook is no longer hanging if I just simply take this knight. So I can just win a piece there and be completely winning. Totally missed it. Did not see it at all. So I thought that black basically had to go into queen h6 and go into this nonsense, completely missing that I just have captures here. So I was a little bit perplexed when my opponent went knight e3 here and just allowed knight takes h3, knight takes d1, rook takes d1, which just leaves me up a clean piece. And that's essentially the game. I mean, there's a technical task here to still be done, but as far as you know, the challenge of achieving a winning game, I mean, I'm just up a clean piece here. And it's kind of unfortunate. I feel a little bit bad for my opponent because this has happened to me even recently in an OTB game where, you know, up through here, I had played and analyzed before, and I made a few very obvious development moves, and then my opponent blunders, just basically right out of opening preparation and into a lost position. And, you know, a few moves later, he's down a piece. And those kind of games completely suck to play, but, you know, it happens. So there were a few maybe slightly interesting moments technically here. My opponent played a5, of course, threatening to go a4, a takes b3, a takes b3, and something like rook a2. And so I sort of very quickly decided that I should either go a3, intending to meet a4 with b4, or just go a4 immediately and stop the pawn from making it to the a4 square. Take a second and think about which one you'd choose, a3 or a4. So I played a3, and I think that's not the best move. And the problem is that I think that a3 is much better than a4 if black goes a4 and allows me to go b4. Because then this pawn is a weakness, he has basically no counterplay on the queen side, and this bishop with the pawn on the b4 square would be extremely constricted. But if black doesn't go b4 and just leaves a5, a3, the a3 pawn is a little bit weak, I think. And at a couple different points during the game, after I played e3, I just wanted to play a4 anyway. So I think just going a4 immediately is better. It fixes a5 as a weakness, and doesn't leave the a3 pawn weak. Just grabbing a little bit of extra space too never hurt anyone. So, but I went a3, and my opponent went f6. Just I don't know. I didn't understand his idea at the time, but now, looking back on it, it's quite a funny idea. So I go knight f2, just fixing my bad knight on h3, and also unpinning my rook on d1, protecting it such that I can go e5 now, and after f takes e5, I can capture back with the pawn and not have to worry about it. And then my opponent goes knight h8, which is a funny idea, intending to reroute the knight to f7, possibly d6. And I thought for quite a while here, there are a lot of moves. I could go a4, for instance, and just admit my mistake. I could go knight f4. I didn't like knight f4 because it sort of pseudo-traps my rook on f5. Or I can go something like d5 or e5 and try to blow things open for my extra piece. And I think those moves are the most logical, and I spent the most time deciding between d5 or e5. I think both are good. For instance, after e5, I looked at g6, rook f3, f5, just knight f4, and I think white is clearly winning. It would be hard to stop d5, and after that, I think white's pieces will just jump into action. But I eventually decided on just d5. I liked that I could go knight d4, knight f4, and have sort of this view towards the weak e6 square, and that I was threatening to sort of open up a second weakness on c6. So he went knight f7, and I went knight d4. He took, and I took with the rook. Taking with the pawn is perfectly acceptable, but I just decided to try and bully him away from the open files with trades. And he went rook d to c8, not wanting to trade a bunch of pieces. And probably here, rook d7 is just the most obvious and cleanest move, hopping onto the 7th rank and probably winning more material. But I just decided to simplify my tasks slightly, and I just went rook c1. Because, if he goes rook e8, then I go rook d7 anyway, or rook b8, rook d7, and so I think he's sort of just forced to trade to gain a little bit of time. And here he went a4, which I don't agree with at all, because now I get to go b4. I think his idea was to go, as I illustrate, rook c8, rook c3, and take a look at my weak a3 pawn, but it doesn't end up working out all that well. And the inclusion of a4 and b4 really makes this bishop bad and this pawn a little bit weak. So he goes knight d6, which I think is probably a slight error. I mean, at this point, it's sort of academic, but the problem with knight d6 is that it allows knight f5, which allows me to trade off another set of minor pieces by force. Then he goes rook c8, and I just go bishop f4. So now it becomes clear how bad I think Black's bishop is. d6 is extremely well guarded. d8 is sort of looked upon by my rook. f8 is really not an improvement, and he can't really go to c5 or anything because of this pawn. He goes rook c3. I go rook d3, of course, and he goes rook b3, which, okay, I mean, it's a way to try and complicate the game, but I was able to calculate pretty easily that just after this, he doesn't get to push the pawn, and I just march my king over to the queen side and nibble on this b3 pawn, and at that point, I'm up a piece and a pawn, and I have a passer on the queen side, so for the most part, technically, the game is pretty much just dead winning for me, and this is kind of a funny moment. My opponent played g6, and I could just play g4 here and protect the pawn, and after g5 go something like bishop c7, which just stops bishop d8 and leaves his bishop with no active squares. And then I just continue with the plan of going king c3, basically. But I realized that after g6, after something like king e2, g5, bishop c7, I just gain king e2 for free, which is a useful tempo. And if he takes like he did in the game, then I mean that's not really an improvement. g6 and g takes f5 doesn't really have any real point. So I just continue, win the b3 pawn. I don't even have to play this move. I think I could play something else like a4 or I don't know, h4. Bishop c7. There are lots of moves worth considering. Just because I give his king the d4 square when I take on b3, it doesn't really matter. But so I play knight b2, and I think he plays b5 to sort of restrict this piece on b2. But after knight d1, it sort of becomes clear that both b5 and f5 are pretty weak. My opponent goes king d5. I go knight e3, he goes king e4 to protect the f5 pawn, and I go a4. Just creating a passed pawn and getting my advantages rolling. And my opponent played h5. I could just play really much of anything. I think as in the game, I could play queen b5 here, or king b5 rather. I could go b5, but that allows bishop c5 just as in the game. So probably king b5, king c4, and then b5. It's possible, but I just decided to block his pawn with h4 first. Something like king b5, h4 would allow him to at least exchange off another set of pawns, and if for some freak reason he ends up winning both my b pawn and my g3 pawn, I would have to mate with a bishop and a knight. You guys know I can do that because of practical chess endings number 4, but I don't think it's necessary. I think I can just go h4, and now h5 is also a weakness, and I'll always have 2 pawns on the king side that he's not going to be able to take. So my opponent goes bishop f8 for lack of a better move. And again, I could go b5 here, but that does allow bishop c5, which would guard b6 and threaten to take my knight. And so, yeah, it's just, I didn't think it was worth it. So I just went king b5, intending to go king c4, and then b5. And my opponent stopped that with king d4. But that hangs the f5 pawn. And now he goes king. I play knight d6 check, blocking the bishop. He goes king d5. And I thought for a while here, again, I'm winning if I just simply move my knight to, f5 or e8, c8, wherever, b7. It doesn't really matter. But I decided that perhaps the most precise was just to simply go king a6. Getting my pawn rolling while the knight still blocks the bishop from taking on b4. My point being, of course, that bishop takes d6, bishop takes d6, king takes d6, b5, king c7, king a7 just completely wins. I guard the queening square, and I just go, in 3 consecutive moves, b8 equals queen. So he can't take, and now my pawn is going. So I kind of like that move. I think it's kind of a clever little idea. So he goes bishop e7, of course, intending to go bishop d8 and guard the b6 square. I go b5, bishop d8, and I could win after just simply this, of course, and he would have to take it, and I would take back, and that would be stone cold winning for me as well, but I decided to just go knight f7 because all of these squares are protected. He can't stay on the diagonal. And so after this, the best he could do was win my knight for the queen. And after king g7, I played bishop d6, forcing a trade of his last minor piece, and won pretty easily from here. I won't provide any insightful commentary on checkmating with a queen. And that was game 1. Pretty clean game. I was generally happy with my play, my level of preparation. There were some little moments where I think both of us could have improved slightly. I think the key moments, I believe, for the critical moments for both of us, I think, were after f4. My opponent should have probably played f6 and gone into this line, which is pretty unclear. And then I think another critical moment was after d4, knight g6. I found the correct knight d3, which gives me a pretty comfortable edge. And then probably after bishop b2, my opponent needs something else. His queen c8 was, I think, not the best solution. Probably, I mentioned after the game that knight d5 might be better. Again, black has less central space and will have even less central space after e4. And I think it makes sense to trade off a set of minor pieces, especially when you consider in the game after something like queen c8, e4, that this knight is also not very good. Actually, both knights. This position is so hilarious because of how symmetric it is, actually. Both of these knights on b6 and g6 are restricted by the same constellation of g3, h2, and a2, b3, which is pretty funny. And d4, e4. So, this, and this. Pretty hilarious. But I think knight d5 probably, just trying to trade off a set of minor pieces, was maybe the best. Of course, after knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, white would be much better after something like this. But after knight takes d5, black could take on the isolated d pawn and at least stop my play in the center for the time being. I think my opponent mentioned this line after the game that he just didn't want to take on this d pawn, which is fair. I mean, it is a weakness, but also my bishop on b2 isn't very good. I no longer get to expand in the center with e4, and my structure isn't peachy keen either. I have 3 pawn islands as well. I have a backward pawn on e3 rather. It's worth considering after knight d5 to just go something like queen e2. And after knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, for instance, I'm ready to go e4 again. But Yeah, and then of course after knight e2, my opponent should find something other than bishop h3. I'm not sure what now. His position is already pretty difficult, I think, just due to the lack of space. Maybe a5 is worth considering here, but something like a5, I don't know, rook c1 with d5 being kind of a threat would be uncomfortable. So, but yeah, I mean, just sort of as far as Beauvain went, he got a pretty tough position out of the opening, and then sort of right out of my preparation immediately blundered, which is kind of unfortunate, but it was an interesting game nonetheless, and kind of, yeah, a good example of, I think, good preparation and being able to steer the game into positions that you play well compared to your opponents. My opponent admitted after the game that he felt pretty uncomfortable after knight f3 and 1c4, and even after he tried to surprise me with the reverse dragon, I had pretty intricate knowledge of the positions, even up through 12 d3 and the resulting b3 bishop b2 plan. So study your middle games that come out of your openings, and it will help you. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. My second round game is tomorrow, actually, at 4. That would be, what the hell is tomorrow's date? The 9th, at 4 o'clock my time, which would be Eastern time. If you guys want to spectate live, you can do that. Of course, I will be recording that game. Not live. I think 45-45 is a little long for that. There'd be a lot of dead air that I would have to fill with like cheesy dad jokes and nonsense. And Game of Thrones isn't on, so I don't really know what I would talk about. But spectate on that. I will probably record my thoughts right after the game. I did that with this game, except that my mic wasn't on. And so this is the second time I'm recording that game. But, live and learn. Okay, I hope you guys enjoy.